Hello everyone, how are you? For today's lesson, I'm showing you solving trig equation key. I know many of you were confused whether their answers were correct or not, so we're gonna go over the answers together. The first equation, you subtract the 2 and you divide by 4, you get sine x equals negative half. And on the unit circle, and I put it right here, there are two angles that have sine equals negative half. Well, this is the first angle, which is 11 pi over 6. And this is the other one, which is 7 pi over 6. They both have sine equals negative half. Today I'm trying to record from my computer, and I'm sorry, I know some of you have asked me to record horizontally. I forgot about that. I'll flip around. Number 2, you subtract the 8 first, divide by 4, you get secant equals negative 2. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so cosine equals negative half. And you look at the unit circle, and the two angles that have cosine equals negative half. Again, the cosine is the x coordinate. So for x equals negative half, you're gonna find two angles, which are the 2 pi over 3 right here and the 4 pi over 3. So that's why our solution includes 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. For cotan, so add the square root of 3 on both sides, and cotan is 1 over 10. So the tan is 1 over square root of 3. It's not going to look familiar until you rationalize it. And square root of 3 over 3, it means the sine has to have a square root of 3 in it. So if you look at angles pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6, they both have a sine that has a square root of 3 in it. So you can see that. Square root of 3 in it, pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6, but one is positive, one is negative. So that's why if we look at the pi, looking back at the solutions, oops, I don't know what happened. Let me get it back real quick. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Okay, so pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6, because the 5 pi over 6 will give you a negative result, a negative tan, and that's not what you're looking for. Versus 7 pi over 6, when you divide negative by negative, you will end up with a positive tan, and that was the question. So the tan has to be square root of 3 over 3. We know the sine, the top, which is sine, has to have a square root of 3 in it. And this is how we get both of these angles. Number 4, add a 1 on each side, then divide by 3. And then, since it's a square, just like the regular, when we solve an equation that has a square, we square root. When we square root, we always have plus or minus. Square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 3 is square root of 3. So there's two ways to do that. You can rationalize it, but I would prefer if you don't do that. And the reason why, because cotan is cosine over sine. And if you look, cosine over sine equals 1 over square root of 3, you can tell that you want the sine to have a square root of 3 in it. Or you can rationalize it, that's not a problem. So if you look at pi over 3, the sine has a square root of 3 in it. If you look at 2 pi over 3, the sine has a square root of 3 in it. And if you look at 5 pi over 3, same thing, and 4 pi over 3. And the reason why we got 4 answers because we have the positive and the negative. So 2 of these will give positive and 2 of these will give negative cotan. So number 5. It's a little more complicated. I can't add a 3 because once I add a 3, I have a sine squared and a sine. So this is when we look at the x method. Imagine the sine was a t, or u in this case. I called it u. So 2u squared plus 5u minus a 3 equals 0. You solve that using the x method. And I know some of you texted me they were missing the dividing by 2. And the reason why we divide by 2 is because you have a 2 next to the u squared, just like we say 2 next to the x squared. So when you divide by u, you can see that 2u minus 1, 2u, or u plus 3 equals 0. Sine plus 3 equals 0. Sine equals -3. That's not acceptable because, as you guys remember, sine and cosine both have to be between -1 and 1. And if you remember, the reason is on the unit circle, it's a unit circle, so the radius is 1. It goes from -1 to 1 for cosine. Also, it goes from -1 to 1 for sine. So that solution is not acceptable. I cross it off. And the only solution is sine x equals half, and that would be easy to look at the two angles that have a y coordinate of half, which are pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. It's kind of cut in here, I'm sorry. Similarly, number 6, you solve it using x method, divide by 2, because the a coefficient of the squared function is 2. So divide by 2. And you get two solutions, tan equals 2 and tan equals -3 over 2. I know those two aren't remarkable, like you can't tell what are the remarkable angles. So for those one, I just used the calculator and inverse tan gave me those two angles. So just as long as you know how to follow up the method, but those two angles aren't remarkable. Okay.